So I really agree with this definition of science. Actually, it's a pretty strict definition, but it gets to the essence of what empirical science is and the real purpose of doing science. The purpose of describing nature, and description being either explanation or prediction, I think, is a perfect way to define science. Um, and you talked about how paradigms are a lot like metaphors, but that there's nothing behind the metaphor itself, or nothing behind the description, nothing behind the equation. Um, the equation works because each of the components of the equation, um, at their roots, are based on measurable features. So in that sense, it seems like there is something behind the description. There are measurable features behind the description. Um, and it really, but all that's really saying is that our experience of the world, or our empirical observation of the world, must guide our beliefs or the metaphors that we hold in order to understand the data we've collected. Because, science as an explanation or prediction of the behavior of nature is interesting, because then, what falls under nature? What is culture? And is that exempt from nature, or is all of culture just a different way of nature expressing itself? Because if culture is a different way of nature expressing itself, then science can study culture. I mean, that's anthropology, but if you don't think political science is a science, strictly speaking, I don't think you would think anthropology was either. Maybe you'd give more credit to anthropology, I'm not sure. Um, but to define science as description of nature, we have to then define culture. Because, what you mentioned at the end of your video, that when the scientist is confronted about the social implications of whatever it is that they're studying, they should relinquish their role as a scientist and say, look, I can only speak now as a person. And I, this made me think of Minsky, Marvin Minsky, just because I had the chance to ask him the question right up front, um, because he wants to build a human machine, an emotion machine. And the question was, well, what are the ethical implications? What does this new human robot have the rights of an individual human being? If you're claiming that it is a human being, or for all intents and purposes, is equal to the cognitive existence of a human being. And he said it's not his problem. That's for the politicians to worry about. And my response was, well, the politicians don't seem to be do a too good of a job setting a good moral example for the rest of us. And that was the end of the discussion, really. And to some extent, yeah, I can see how we can't have politics interfering with science. But at the end of the day, the scientist is still a human being, and all of his or her scientific data is going to have to be assimilated. If it is good data, correct data, it's going to have to be assimilated by the culture to make it useful in any way. And so you can't have science in a vacuum, um, because the culture is always using the science in particular ways, and the science is always being directed by the culture in particular ways. The United States spends 500 or 600 billion dollars on defense technology, military technology every year. Now that money could be going towards any number of technologies, and if it were, we would be seeing amazing developments in those fields. Um, new explanations and predictions and technologies for things we never would have found otherwise if the money hadn't hadn't been there. So the culture, in other words, or the political atmosphere can definitely guide science.